basically, China's energy industry is huge, and then the future energy demand is growing very fast. And then the most important point that Chinese planners they have to take care is energy supply security. Now, Chinese authority, Chinese energy planners, they are giving highest priority to diversify the supply sources. In particular, they are very concerned about heavy dependence on sea lane supply. So that's the reason why they are very anxious to accelerate this pipeline development as a way of diversifying, because their projection on crude oil import is very substantial, very large. So they would like to balance it. That was the reason why they were willing to pay large amount of money for pipeline oil import from Russia. Now, in the case of natural gas, the characteristic of gas import is quite different from crude oil. Chinese planners, they are placing highest priority not for import, actually domestic production. That was the reason why shale gas production was highlighted. But at this moment, until 2020, the scale of shale gas production is not going to be substantial. So quite large scale of volume should be imported by either pipeline gas or LNG. Now, because LNG prices are quite expensive, so they would like to balance the financial burden of importing. That is the reason why they have invested so much money for pipeline gas import from Central Asian Republic, in particular Turkmenistan. One of the characteristics of this Central Asian pipeline gas to China is that Chinese state oil company CNPC was allowed to develop upstream gas and then import it by themselves, which means that CNPC can make some profit, sizable profit in upstream development. Then they can subsidize that one in downstream sector. So this is how they can balance the import price burden. Now, that is the difference between Central Asian Republic and then Russia. Russia is asking China just to open their market, not to allow upstream equity positioning. So that is the reason why China was delaying, not prioritizing the gas import from Russia. And then another issue that I have to mention about this coal import. China is as the biggest coal producer. They are starting to import quite a large scale of coal. Last 2 years ago, the scale of coal import was only 100 or 110 million ton. Now, 2011, the scale became 170 million ton. Now, by the end of this year, the volume will be as much as 240 million tons. This is quite scary figures to go creeping up. Now, Chinese planners are very anxious to make sure this supply will not cause any problem in line with their economic development. But at the same time, they have to think of this environmental pollution burden, CO2 emission, very large scale of CO2 emission from massive dependence on coal. That is a huge problem. So Chinese planners are very much conscientious about this burden, at the same time the importance of a supply issue. Actually, this shale gas initiative is taken by Ministry of Land and Resources. In China, during the last 10 years, there is a massive expansion of conventional gas. But because of this revolution of shale gas in America, and then the success, Chinese planners, they want to repeat that sort of success. in China as well. And then EIA was telling there is a huge potential of shale gas reserves in China. But I have to be a little bit cautious on this projection. Potential may be great, but in reality, transforming the potential into production is not easy, because in America, shale gas revolution is based on 100 years, huge efforts based on geological data understanding and then infrastructure. Everything is already there. But in China, it's a very early stage, and then they don't know what sort of geological structure and then the data. Even though the initiative was taken by Ministry of Land and Resources, however, the main developers are Chinese NOC like CNPC and Sinopec. Virtually, they are controlling the all main shale gas development deposits, basins, reserves, 80%. The remaining 20% are being opened to these new players. However, without these two major NOCs, significant contribution and implementation, nothing will happen. So I'm not that positive about very fast track success in shale gas development in China. By 2020, I would say there will be quite step-by-step, modest implementation. Whether this shale gas revolution in China will be successful or not, we will see around 2018 and 2020. Then we will know whether they can really make it or not. So I would like to make a cautious judgment at this stage. Nuclear energy is a very in Japan's energy balance. It's playing very important role. To close down all these nuclear power plant, which is over 57, and I think the total number of nuclear power plants are around 57, something like that. To close down all these nuclear power plants will deliver real headache to the energy planners in Tokyo, because they have to find a way to replace this significant role by nuclear power plant. And then politicians, because they are very opportunistic, they are all the time talking about removal of nuclear option immediately. But what is the alternative? What is the replacement? And then how willing for these innocent or ordinary consumers willing to pay that price burden? That is the big question. Now, this is the reason why Japanese government officers, in particular MITI bureaucrats, they are very much worried about the financial burden of this immediate removal of this nuclear power option. So if I'm asked to advise that nuclear policy in Japan, I would suggest that the very best way is to go for step-by-step approach. I mean, already they have seen the price. During this Sakhalin, late September, during Sakhalin Oil and Gas Conference, MITI Energy Agency, Mr. Ando, was highlighting the financial burden that Japan was facing. For the first time, Japan has seen this trade deficit since the first oil price crisis, early 1970s. So that after Fukushima disaster, almost 20 million tons of LNG import caused too much financial burden to the normal Japanese consumers. So Japanese government itself is very much worried about this uncontrollable financial burden. But if these nuclear power plants are removed immediately, then how they can afford to cover all this financial burden? That's a big question. So I would suggest that that has to be step-by-step approach.